The convoy died in silence. 3 miles of frozen mountain road, and not a single distress call made it through. The ambush had been executed with surgical precision, IEDs detonating in sequence along the valley floor, cutting the supply vehicles into isolated pockets of burning steel and screaming men. By the time the smoke cleared, 47 vehicles lay scattered across the frozen wasteland like broken toys, and 300 Marines found themselves pinned against the valley walls with nowhere to run. Lieutenant Sarah Bennett watched it all through her rifle scope from a northern ridge, 200 meters above the carnage. Her breath came in controlled puffs of white vapor, each exhale measured, disciplined, the product of 11 years behind a long-range rifle. The cold had seeped through her 3 layers of winter gear hours ago, settling into her bones like an unwelcome guest that had no intention of leaving. "They're organizing," she said into her radio, her voice flat, professional, the voice of a woman who had seen this before. Through her scope, she could see them massing on the southern ridge, enemy fighters moving with the confidence of men who believed they had already won, artillery pieces being wheeled into position, mortar crews establishing fire bases along the tree line, and below, in that frozen valley, 300 Marines were about to become a turkey shoot. 200 meters to her left, Corporal Emma Bennett had her own scope trained on the same nightmare. She was 3 years younger than Sarah, but their eyes held the same weight, the same memories, the same scars that didn't show on the skin. They had signed their contracts on the same day, stood on the same yellow footprints at Paris Island. Their drill instructors had tried to separate them. Standard procedure for siblings, but the Bennett sisters had a way of finding each other. They always did. "I count 1,200. Emma's voice crackled through the radio. "Maybe more. They've got PCAM positions on 3 quadrants, spotters everywhere. This isn't random. They knew the convoy was coming." Sarah swept her scope across the enemy positions. Emma was right. This wasn't an ambush of opportunity. This was a planned execution. The enemy had artillery on the high ground, mortar crews positioned for overlapping fire, and enough fighters to overwhelm the trapped Marines 4 times over. And somewhere behind them, 300 meters away from the actual fighting, Major Thomas Collins sat in his command post, studying maps that couldn't show him what was really happening. "Command, this is Overwatch 1, Sarah transmitted, requesting immediate fire mission on enemy positions. Grid reference. Negative, Overwatch." Collins' voice came back clipped, precise. "Weather has grounded all air assets. QRF is 12 hours out. You're ordered to maintain position and observe only. Do not engage." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Sir, I have eyes on 300 Marines who are about to be overrun. The enemy is establishing artillery. I am aware of the tactical situation, Lieutenant." Collins' tone left no room for argument. "Ground reinforcements are inbound. Air support will be available when weather clears. Your orders are to hold position and maintain observation. Do not engage. Acknowledge. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more incredible stories of courage and sacrifice, and hit that notification bell so you never miss one. Now, let me take you back to that frozen ridge where everything was about to change. The radio felt heavy in Sarah's hand. She had heard these words before. Different voices, different wars, but always the same message. Hold position. Wait for support. Trust the system. In Fallujah, she had trusted the system. Her team had held a rooftop position for 19 hours when orders said to hold for 6. 3 men had died waiting for reinforcements that arrived 2 hours too late. In Helmand province, the system had promised extraction within 30 minutes. The extraction came in 4 hours, and 3 more Marines went home in boxes. "Acknowledged," Sarah said into the radio. "Overwatch maintaining position." She switched off her primary frequency. Emma's voice came through on their secondary channel, the private frequency they had used since Afghanistan. "Sarah, it wasn't a question. It was recognition." Emma had seen her sister make that exact movement. The deliberate click of the radio dial, the slight shift in posture. Twice before, both times, people who should have died had lived instead. "Temperature down there is dropping fast," Sarah said. She swept her scope across the valley floor, counting bodies. Some are still moving. Most weren't. The wounded won't survive 4 hours in this cold, let alone 12. I count 32 wounded from up here. 14 look critical. Sarah did the math in her head. 14 critical wounded, exposed to sub-zero temperatures, with enemy artillery about to rain down on them. Even if the enemy never fired another shot, half those Marines would be dead from hypothermia before reinforcements arrived. The convoy was hit 40 minutes ago, Sarah continued. First mortar round lands in the next 20 minutes. Those wounded go from critical to Kia. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Through her scope, she watched the enemy positions, the methodical way they were setting up, the practiced movements of men who had done this before. She saw the forward observers moving into position along the ridge, the ones who would call in the artillery strikes that would turn the valley floor into a graveyard. Command doesn't have eyes on what we're seeing, Emma said finally. They're 300 meters back, reading grids on a map. They don't know. They know enough. Sarah's voice carried no bitterness, only cold recognition. Collins is following his own orders. There's a bigger picture we're not seeing. Strategic considerations, risk assessment, resource allocation. He's not wrong by his own framework. His framework gets 300 Marines killed. Yes. The word hung between them like frost in the air. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, working blood back into her legs. At this altitude, in this cold, staying still too long meant losing feeling in your extremities. Losing feeling meant losing precision. And precision was the only weapon they had. There are 1,200 fighters down there, Emma said. We have 2 rifles. I know. Our effective range puts us at 1,900 to 2,300 meters from most targets. That's beyond optimal for these conditions. Wind is 3 knots northeast, but it's been shifting. I know. If we engage, we're committing to a 6-hour hold until reinforcements arrive. Just the 2 of us, against artillery, mortars, and enough ground forces to swarm this ridge 10 times over. I know. Emma let out a long breath, watching it crystallize in the frozen air. And if we don't engage, 300 Marines die while we watch. Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. They had been having this conversation their entire lives. Not with words, but with shared glances across crowded rooms, with slight nods during impossible moments, with the unspoken understanding that had grown between them since childhood. In the Bennett household, promises had been survival currency. Their father had made promises too. I'll stop drinking. I'll be better. I'll never hurt you again. And every broken promise had taught them the same lesson. Words were worthless unless backed by action. So the sisters had made their own promises. Silent ones. The kind that didn't need to be spoken because they were written into the bone. I will always come for you. I will never leave you behind. I will do what needs to be done, even when it costs everything. The first target should be their forward artillery observer, Sarah said, her voice shifting into tactical mode. He's the one in the brown coat, 2,100 meters out on the southern ridge. Take him down, and their artillery loses its eyes. I see him. Emma made a minute adjustment to her scope. What about the mortar crews? 5 crews, approximately 20 personnel, 1,800 meters. We work left to right. Prioritize the team leaders first. Without coordination, the crews become ineffective. And when they figure out where we are, Sarah allowed herself a grim smile that Emma couldn't see. Then we relocate. Again and again, we keep moving, keep shooting, and make them think there's a company up here instead of 2 Marines with rifles. 2 Marines with rifles. Emma laughed softly, the dark, hollow laugh of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Against 1,200. Better odds than Hellman. It wasn't, and they both knew it. But it was what Sarah needed to say, and Emma needed to hear. The sisters had survived impossible situations before by lying to themselves just enough to keep moving forward. Sarah, Emma's voice dropped lower. If we do this, when we do this, we're throwing away everything. Our careers, our records, everything we built in 11 years. They'll court-martial us. Maybe worse. I know. And you're okay with that? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching through her scope as the enemy artillery observer raised his binoculars toward the valley floor. In a few minutes, He would begin calling in coordinates. In a few minutes, the first shells would fall, and in a few minutes, Marines who had trusted the system would start dying because the system had failed them. I spent 11 years following orders, Sarah said finally. Most of those orders were right. Some of them weren't. And when they weren't, people died. People I could have saved if I had been willing to act instead of wait. She thought about Fallujah, about Corporal Martinez, who had bled out on that rooftop. While Sarah waited for extraction, that never came. About the promise she had made over his body. The silent promise that she would never again let good Marines die because someone 300 meters away had a different framework for what was possible. I'm done waiting, Sarah said. I'm done watching. If they want to court-martial me for saving 300 lives, they can put that on my record, but I'm not putting 300 dead Marines on my conscience. Not again. Emma was silent for 5 seconds. 10. Then her voice came through clear and steady. What's my first target? Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not relief exactly, but recognition. This was who they were. This was who they had always been. Two sisters who had learned young that the only person you could truly count on was the one who shared your blood and your scars. Mortar Crew 3, 1,800 meters. Team leader is the one with the red keffiyeh. On my mark, we fire simultaneously. Your target and mine. The confusion of two simultaneous kills will make it harder for them to locate our positions initially. Copy. Emma settled into her rifle, her breathing slowing to the deep, measured rhythm of a shooter preparing for a long-range engagement. Wind check. 3 knots northeast. Should push about 2 inches right at this distance. Compensate accordingly. Compensating. Emma made her adjustments, her movements economical and precise. 11 years of training, condensed into the slight shift of fingers against cold metal. Ready on your mark. Sarah centered her crosshairs on the artillery observer's chest. At 2,100 meters, the margin for error was measured in millimeters. A flinch, a poorly timed breath, a momentary lapse in concentration. Any of these could mean the difference between a kill shot and a miss that revealed their position. But Sarah Bennett didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched in Fallujah or Helmand, or any of the dozen other hellholes where the Corps had sent her. And she wasn't going to start now. 3, she counted. 2, 1, mark. 2 rifles cracked simultaneously across the frozen mountain air. The sound echoed off the valley walls, bouncing back and forth until it was impossible to tell where it had originated. 2,100 meters away, the artillery observer crumpled without a sound. 1,800 meters away, the mortar team leader's body jerked backward and fell. Target down, Sarah confirmed. Target down, Emma echoed. In the space of 2 seconds, the enemy had lost their artillery coordination, and one of their 5 mortar crews had lost its leader. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. They had just announced their presence to 1,200 fighters, and now the clock was ticking. Relocate, Sarah ordered. 50 meters east. They'll have spotted our muzzle flash. Both sisters moved with practiced efficiency, gathering their equipment and repositioning along the ridge. Below, they could hear shouting, the sound of an enemy force, suddenly realizing that they weren't as alone as they had thought. By the time Sarah settled into her new position, the enemy had already begun scrambling. Officers were shouting orders, fighters were taking cover behind rocks and vehicles, and the remaining mortar crews were frantically trying to identify the source of the incoming fire. They're panicking, Emma observed. Good. It won't last. They'll figure out we're on this ridge soon enough. Our job is to keep them disorganized long enough for... Sarah paused, doing the math in her head. 6 hours. We need to buy 6 hours. 6 hours against 1,200. Emma chambered another round. What's our round count? Sarah had done the calculation before they started. She always did. I've got 93 rounds. You? 87. 180 rounds between them against 1,200 fighters. Even if every single shot was a kill, which was impossible, they would run out of ammunition long before they ran out of targets. We need to be surgical, Sarah said. No wasted shots. Every round has to count. Every round has counted since we were 18. It was true, The Bennett sisters hadn't become the Marine Corps' most effective sniper team by spraying bullets and hoping for the best. They had earned their reputation through precision, to the thousands of hours of training that turn a rifle into an extension of their bodies and a target into a problem that could be solved with a single, perfect solution. Next target, Sarah said. PKM position, 1,900 meters, 10 degrees left of the burning Humvee. The gunner is setting up a field of fire that'll cover Marines' only escape route. I see him. Emma adjusted her scope, taking the shot. The rifle cracked. The PKM gunner slumped over his weapon. Target down. Relocating. They fell into the rhythm of it. The terrible, precise rhythm that had made them legends in circles, where being a legend meant something dark and necessary. Fire. Confirm. Relocate. Fire again. Sarah worked through her target priority list with methodical efficiency. Radio operators first. Cut the communication. Cut the coordination. Then the officers, the ones whose body language and positioning marked them as leaders. Then the heavy weapon crews, the mortar teams, the machine gunners who could do the most damage to the trapped Marines below. Every shot was a calculation. Distance, wind, temperature, elevation, the way the cold air would affect bullet trajectory differently than warm air, the slight variations in muzzle velocity that came with each round fired, the fatigue accumulating in their trigger fingers, the stiffness creeping into their joints. Thermal team, Emma's voice cut through. Moving up the ridge toward your position. 300 meters and closing. Sarah swept her scope right and found them. 4 figures in winter camouflage, carrying thermal imaging equipment that would cut through the concealment like it wasn't there. Standard procedure for hunting snipers. Someone down there had finally gotten organized. How long until they're in thermal range? 3 minutes, maybe less. Sarah considered her options. At 300 meters, she could take all 4 of them before they got a lock on her position. But that would mean 4 shots from a stationary position, each one giving away her location more precisely than the last. Split them, she decided. You take the leader, I'll take the man with the thermal unit. Simultaneous shots. Then immediate relocation. We need to move at least 100 meters before the survivors can report our position. Copy. Emma was already adjusting. Ready on your mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. 2 more cracks echoed across the frozen air. 2 bodies fell. The remaining thermal team members dove for cover. But by the time they recovered, both sisters had already vanished into the rocks. It was a dance as old as warfare itself. The endless game of hide and seek between snipers and those who hunted them. But the Bennett sisters had learned this dance in places where the stakes were measured in blood, and they had been dancing longer than most of their enemies had been alive. Status on the valley? Sarah asked as she settled into her new position. Emma scanned the chaos below. The mortar fire has dropped by 60%. Artillery hasn't landed a shell in 15 minutes. The Marines are starting to fortify their positions. Looks like they figured out someone's running interference. Good. They'll last longer if they can dig in. But even as she said it, Sarah could see the problem developing. The enemy forces were adapting. After the initial chaos of losing their coordination, they were falling back on smaller unit tactics. Teams of 10 to 15 fighters, moving independently toward the Marine positions without central command. It was harder to stop. Decapitation strikes only worked when there was a head to cut off. Against 12 independent assault teams, the sisters would have to stop each one individually. They're organizing assault groups, Emma confirmed. I count 6. No, 8 teams forming on the southern ridge. They're going to hit the valley from multiple angles simultaneously. Then we give them something else to worry about. Sarah spotted the largest concentration of fighters. 40 or 50 men gathered around what looked like a field headquarters. I'm engaging the command group. That tent on the eastern approach, 2,200 meters. That's past optimal range in these conditions. I know. Sarah settled into her rifle, letting her body find familiar positions that had been drilled into her since Paris Island. But if I can hit their field commander, the assault teams lose their coordination. And if you miss, they know exactly where we are. Sarah didn't respond. She was already calculating. The wind that had shifted 2 degrees in the last hour. the temperature that was continuing to drop, the way the fading light would affect her target acquisition. At 2,200 meters, the target was little more than a shape in her scope, a figure in dark clothing, gesturing to men around him, clearly in command. Sarah watched him for 10 seconds, learning his patterns of movement, identifying the moments when he would be still. She exhaled slowly, letting her heartbeat settle into the space between contractions. The trigger felt impossibly light under her finger. She fired. For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. At 2,200 meters, the bullet took over 3 seconds to reach its target. 3 seconds of uncertainty, of watching and hoping and calculating whether everything had been accounted for. Then the figure in dark clothing crumpled, and the men around him scattered like startled birds. "Target down," Sarah confirmed. "Relocating." "Nice shooting." There was genuine respect in Emma's voice. "But they're coming. I've got movement on the northern approach. Looks like a squad-sized element heading toward your last position." Sarah was already moving, her rifle slung across her back as she picked her way through the frozen rocks. The ridge was a maze of boulders and ice, and she had spent the last 2 hours learning its every crevice and shadow. She knew where she could disappear and where she would be exposed, where the terrain offered cover and where it offered only death. 300 meters below, Major Collins' voice crackled on her disabled primary radio, a broadcast on the emergency frequency that she could still receive even with her transmit function off. "Overwatch 1, this is command. Be advised, we are receiving reports of enemy casualties from unknown source. Confirm your status and engagement posture. Acknowledge immediately." Sarah ignored the transmission. Whatever Collins thought was happening, whatever reports were filtering back to his command post, it was too late to stop what she and Emma had started. The only way out now was through. "Emma, what's our round count?" "I'm down to 64. "You?" 71. 135 rounds remaining against roughly 1,100 fighters, minus 100 or so they had already eliminated. The math was still impossible, but it was getting better. "We need to slow down," Sarah said. "No more double taps, no more confirmation shots. Every trigger pull has to be a kill. Every trigger pull has been a kill for the last hour. Then let's keep it that way." The afternoon wore on, and the sisters continued their work. They moved across the ridge like ghosts, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted, never revealing themselves to the thermal teams that continued to hunt them. Every time the enemy thought they had the snipers pinned down, the next shot came from a different angle, a different elevation, a different impossible distance. The Marines in the valley noticed. They couldn't see their guardian angels. The sisters were too far away, too well concealed, but they could see the enemy fighters falling. They could see the assault teams hesitating, the mortar fire becoming erratic, the coordination that had been perfect during the ambush becoming ragged and uncertain. And they could see hope. "They're redistributing their wounded," Emma reported, moving the critical cases into that collapsed building near the center. "Must have figured out it offers the best protection from indirect fire." Sarah processed this information, filing it away. The Marines were adapting, using the breathing room the sisters were providing to improve their positions. Every minute they bought was another minute for the wounded to receive treatment, another minute for defensive positions to be strengthened. "How's our thermal problem?" 2 more teams, 150 meters out. "They're getting better at tracking us." The enemy was learning. That was a problem with fighting an organized force. They adapted. The initial chaos was fading, replaced by methodical hunter-killer tactics that would eventually corner even the most skilled snipers. "We need to reset their timeline," Sarah decided. "Something big enough to throw them back into confusion." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah scanned the enemy positions, looking for the kind of target that would create cascading effects. And then she found it. A technical truck, mounted with a DSHK heavy machine gun, was moving into position on the southern ridge. At 12.7 millimeters, that weapon could tear through the Marines' cover like it wasn't there. But more importantly, it was parked next to a collection of ammunition crates, enough ordnance to supply a company-sized assault. 2,300 meters, Sarah said. The technical with the DSHK, the gunners exposed. Emma found the target in her scope and let out a low whistle. "That's a long shot, even for us." Your personal record is 2,400 meters. You made that shot in Afghanistan in worse conditions than this. I made that shot once, and I was lucky. You weren't lucky. You were good. Sarah's voice carried absolute conviction. You've always been good. You just never believed it because you spent your whole career standing next to me. The words hung in the air between them. There was a reason Sarah was a lieutenant and Emma was a corporal, and it had nothing to do with skill. Sarah had learned early how to speak the language of promotion boards, how to say the right things to the right people. Emma had never cared about any of that. She just wanted to shoot. Take the shot, Sarah said. I'll spot. Emma settled into her rifle. 2,300 meters. In perfect conditions. That was a difficult shot. In sub-zero temperatures, with shifting winds and thermal distortion from the burning vehicles below. It was nearly impossible. But Emma Bennett had spent 11 years learning to do the impossible. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate drop to 60 beats per minute. She felt the wind on her cheek. A slight shift, maybe half a knot. That wasn't showing on the flags below. She accounted for it, making a tiny adjustment to her aim point. The technical gunner was standing at his weapon, scanning the ridge with binoculars. He was looking for them. In a few seconds, he would find them, and when he did, that DSHK would turn this section of the ridge into a kill zone. Emma fired. The bullet flew for 3.5 seconds, an eternity during which anything could happen. A gust of wind, a movement of the target, a miscalculation, so small it wouldn't be noticed until the shot went wide. But the shot didn't go wide. The gunner dropped, and as his body fell, it triggered a chain reaction in the ammunition stores. Secondary explosions ripped to the southern ridge, sending fire and debris into the sky. Enemy fighters scattered in all directions, their assault formations dissolving into chaos. Confirmed kill, Sarah said quietly. Hell of a shot, Emma. Hell of a shot, Emma agreed, but there was no pride in her voice. Only exhaustion. They had been fighting for 4 hours now. 4 hours of constant movement, constant shooting, constant vigilance against the thermal teams that hunted them. Sarah could feel the fatigue accumulating in her muscles, the cold that was no longer just uncomfortable, but actively dangerous. Hypothermia was measured in hours at this temperature, and they had been exposed since dawn. Round count. 48. Emma's voice was getting ragged. You. 52. 100 rounds between them, and the enemy was still coming. But something had changed. The assault teams were no longer pushing toward the valley. They were pulling back, consolidating on the southern ridge. After 4 hours of losing officers and heavy weapons crews, after watching their coordination collapse again and again, the enemy was finally showing signs of hesitation. They're regrouping, Sarah observed, building up for a major push. How many? Sarah counted the figures massing on the southern ridge. Her stomach dropped. 600, maybe more. They had eliminated half the enemy force. 500 or 600 fighters, taken out of the equation through precise rifle fire and the chaos that followed. It should have been a victory. But 600 fighters were still more than enough to overwhelm 300 Marines. And this time, the enemy wouldn't make the mistake of trickling in piecemeal. They would hit all at once, with everything they had. ETA on those reinforcements? Emma asked. Sarah checked her watch. 2 hours. Maybe less if the weather clears. And how long until the assault? Sarah watched the enemy preparations, the way they were organizing into assault waves, the way their remaining officers were positioning their heavy weapons for supporting fire. She had seen this before in Fallujah and Helmand, the deliberate buildup before an overwhelming assault. 30 minutes, 40 at most. 40 minutes, 100 rounds, against 600 fighters. We're not going to stop them, Emma said. It wasn't fear in her voice, just acknowledgement of mathematical reality. Even if every shot is a kill, we don't have enough bullets. No. So what's the plan? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She thought about Corporal Martinez, bleeding out on that rooftop in Fallujah. She thought about the 3 Marines who had died in Helmand waiting for reinforcements that came too late. She thought about the 300 men in the valley below who were counting on someone to save them, even if they didn't know it. We keep shooting, she said finally. We buy as much time as we can. Every minute we delay their assault is another minute for those reinforcements to arrive. And if they don't arrive in time, then we die here. But we die shooting. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only plan they had. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She and Emma worked with desperate efficiency, targeting the enemy's remaining leadership, trying to delay the inevitable assault. Every shot was calculated, every bullet precious. They no longer had the luxury of targeting multiple enemies in sequence. Every round had to count. The enemy's thermal teams got closer. 100 meters. 75. The sisters were being forced into an ever-shrinking area of the ridge, their escape routes narrowing with each passing minute. They've got us pinned, Emma said. If we relocate again, they'll have clear thermal acquisition. Then we don't relocate. Sarah, I know. Sarah loaded her last magazine. 11 rounds remaining. How many do you have? 9. 20 rounds between them, against 600 fighters massing for their final assault. The sisters looked at each other across 200 meters of frozen ridge. They couldn't see each other. They were too well concealed, but they didn't need to see. After 11 years of service together, after a lifetime of unspoken promises and shared sacrifice, they knew exactly where the other was. Whatever happens, Emma said quietly, I'm glad it was us up here. Me too. You know they're going to court-martial us for this. If we survive. I know. And you're okay with that? Sarah thought about the question, really thought about it, in the way she hadn't allowed herself to think during the 6 hours of combat. She thought about her career, her rank, the promotions that had taken a decade to earn. She thought about the reprimand that would follow, the end of any hope for advancement, the permanent stain on her record. And then she thought about 300 Marines who were still alive because she and Emma had refused to follow orders. Yeah, she said, I'm okay with that. The enemy assault began at 1847 hours. 600 fighters rose from the southern ridge and began moving toward the valley. They came in waves, for assault lines staggered, so that when the first line took casualties, the second would flow around them without losing momentum. It was textbook military doctrine, executed with disciplined precision. The sisters opened fire. Sarah's first shot took down a squad leader at 2,000 meters. Her second killed a machine gunner at 1,900. Her third, fourth, fifth. Each bullet found a target. But each bullet was also one less round in her rapidly depleting supply. They're not slowing down, Emma reported. Her rifle cracked 3 times in quick succession. We're not making enough impact. Keep firing. Every casualty we cause is one less fighter hitting the Marines. But Emma was right. The assault was too big, too well organized. Even with perfect accuracy, 2 snipers couldn't stop 600 determined fighters. They could wound the assault, bloody it, but they couldn't stop it. The first wave reached the valley floor. Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy fighters poured over the ridge, firing as they advanced. The Marines returned fire from their hastily constructed positions, but they were still outnumbered 2-1, still pinned down in terrain that offered minimal cover. They're overrunning the forward positions. Emma's voice cracked. The Marines are falling back to the collapsed building. Sarah's scope found the scene. Marines dragging their wounded colleagues toward the largest standing structure, officers trying to organize a defensive perimeter while enemy fire chewed up the ground around them. They were professionals, doing their best in an impossible situation, but they were being overwhelmed. How many rounds? 4. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. You. 5. 9 rounds. 9 chances to make a difference. And the assault was still coming. Sarah forced herself to prioritize the enemy officers, the heavy weapon crews, anyone whose death would create cascading effects. She couldn't stop the assault, but she could decapitate it, rob it of its leadership just as it reached its most critical moment. 4 shots, for officers down, for pockets of confusion in the enemy's assault formations. 1 round remaining. Sarah saved it. 1 bullet. In case Emma needed covering fire. 1 bullet. For the moment when everything else had failed. I'm out, Emma said. I've got nothing left. The enemy was flowing through the valley now, surrounding the Marines' last defensive position. The gunfire was constant, a rolling thunder that echoed off the ridge walls and drowned out everything else. And somewhere in that chaos, 300 Marines were making their last stand. Sarah, Emma's voice was impossibly calm, the calm of someone who had already accepted what was coming. It was an honor. Don't. Sarah's voice was fierce. Don't say goodbye. We're not done yet. We have one bullet, and they have 600 fighters. The math. Screw the math. But even as she said it, Sarah knew Emma was right. They had done everything humanly possible, and it hadn't been enough. The reinforcements were still 90 minutes away. The air support was still grounded. And the assault they had tried so desperately to stop was happening right now, right in front of them, and there was nothing more they could do. Sarah Bennett, who had sworn she would never again let good Marines die while she watched, was about to watch 300 of them die. And then she heard it. At first, she thought it was thunder. The clouds had been low and heavy all day, and thunder wouldn't have been impossible. But this thunder was getting louder, moving closer, and it had a rhythm to it. The unmistakable thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting through cold mountain air. Emma, Sarah's voice caught in her throat. Emma, do you hear that? I hear it. 4 Apache gunships crested the eastern ridge, their distinctive profiles outlined against the gray winter sky. They came in formation, angled for attack, their weapon pylons heavy with Hellfire missiles and 30mm cannon rounds. The lead Apache opened fire. It was like watching the hand of God reach down and smite the enemy's assault. Missiles screamed into the massed fighters, each explosion sending bodies and debris flying in all directions. The 30mm cannons worked in precise bursts, cutting down enemy squads before they could even react. In 60 seconds, the entire tactical situation reversed. The assault that had been moments from overwhelming the Marines dissolved into chaos and retreat. Enemy fighters fled in all directions, abandoning their attack as the Apaches methodically destroyed their formations. The southern ridge, which had been bristling with fighters and heavy weapons, became a smoking ruin. Sarah watched it all through her scope, too exhausted to feel anything except a strange, hollow relief. Command sent air support, Emma said. But Command said air support was grounded. Someone else was listening. Sarah's mind was already working through the possibilities. Someone higher up the chain. Someone who heard what we were doing and made a call. They would never know for certain. In the chaos of military communications, with radio traffic being monitored by multiple agencies and commands, there was no way to determine who had authorized the gunship's deployment. But someone had seen what 2 Marine snipers were doing on that frozen ridge, and someone had decided to help. The Apaches worked the enemy positions for another 20 minutes, ensuring that the assault wouldn't resume. By the time they finished, the enemy force that had numbered 1,200 that morning had been reduced to scattered survivors fleeing into the mountains. All 300 Marines in the valley were alive. Transport helicopters arrived 40 minutes later. The Marines were evacuated first. The wounded loaded onto medevac birds, the able-bodied onto CH-47s that would take them back to the forward operating base. Sarah watched it all from her position on the ridge. Too exhausted to move, her one remaining bullet still chambered in her rifle. She had done the math in her head. Between her scope and Emma's, they had counted 93 confirmed kills over 6 hours of combat. 93 men who would never assault another convoy, never fire another mortar round at trapped Marines. It was the single most productive sniper engagement in the battalion's history, and it had been achieved through direct violation of orders. The military police arrived on the last transport helicopter. There were 4 of them, their faces carefully neutral, their weapons conspicuously present. They found Sarah first, still in her final shooting position, her rifle across her lap. Lieutenant Bennett? That's me? Ma'am, you're under arrest for insubordination and unauthorized engagement of enemy forces. Please surrender your weapon and come with us. Sarah ejected her last remaining round, cleared her rifle, and handed it over. Her hands didn't shake. She had known this was coming since the moment she switched off her radio. My sister, Corporal Bennett, is being detained separately. You'll both be transported to the FOB for processing. They didn't handcuff her. That was something, at least. The MPs escorted her to the helicopter with professional courtesy, as if she were a dignitary rather than a prisoner. Sarah supposed there was some uncertainty in their minds about how to treat a Marine who had just saved 300 lives by disobeying direct orders. She didn't see Emma until they reached the FOB. Her sister was in an adjacent holding room, visible through a window of reinforced glass. Their eyes met for a moment, and Sarah saw her own exhaustion reflected back at her. They had done what needed to be done. Now they would pay the price. The court-martial was held 3 weeks later at a secure facility whose location Sarah was never officially told. She and Emma were charged with insubordination, unauthorized engagement, and reckless endangerment, the last charge referring to their decision to operate without backup or support in a hostile environment. They pleaded guilty to all charges. Their defense counsel had wanted them to fight it. There were arguments to be made. She said, necessity, defense of others, the failure of the chain of command to provide adequate support. A jury might be sympathetic. A skilled lawyer might be able to create enough reasonable doubt. But Sarah and Emma had discussed it in the brief moments when they were allowed to communicate, and they had agreed. They had broken the rules. They had known they were breaking the rules when they did it. The fact that their actions had saved lives didn't change the fundamental truth. They had disobeyed a direct order from their commanding officer. What you did was both heroic and wrong. Those words came from the senior member of the panel, a colonel with 30 years of service and 3 combat deployments. He said them with something that might have been respect, might have been frustration, might have been both. You violated the chain of command. You took actions that could have compromised a larger operation. You made a decision that was not yours to make. The colonel's voice was flat, reciting facts. These are the charges against you, and by your own admission, they are true. Sarah stood at attention, her dress uniform pressed and perfect, her face expressionless. Beside her, Emma mirrored her posture exactly. However, the colonel continued, and something shifted in his tone, we must also acknowledge what your actions accomplished. 300 Marines survived that valley because of what you did. 93 enemy combatants were neutralized. An assault that would have resulted in the complete annihilation of a trapped convoy was prevented. He paused, as if weighing something carefully. The panel has considered the evidence and has reached the following verdict. On the charge of insubordination, guilty. On the charge of unauthorized engagement, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. Sarah didn't flinch. She had expected nothing less. Sentences as follows. Both defendants will receive a formal letter of reprimand to be entered permanently into their service records. Neither defendant will be eligible for promotion for a period of not less than 5 years. Both defendants will retain their current rank and assignment. It was over. Their careers, the steady progression that both sisters had assumed would continue until retirement, was finished. A reprimand was a permanent stain, a mark that promotion boards would see every time their files were reviewed. They would never be captains or majors or colonels. They would never command companies or battalions. They would be what they had always been, snipers, until the day they were too old to do the job anymore. However, the colonel said, and Sarah's attention snapped back to the present. The panel must also recognize that heroism exists even within the context of wrongdoing. Your actions on that ridge demonstrated extraordinary courage, exceptional skill, and a commitment to the lives of your fellow Marines that exemplifies the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. He reached beneath the table and produced a small wooden box. Therefore, by order of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Lieutenant Sarah Bennett and Corporal Emma Bennett are awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. Sarah felt the breath leave her body. The Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military, exceeded only by the Medal of Honor. They were being simultaneously reprimanded and decorated, punished and honored in the same breath. These two facts will exist together, the colonel said, his voice heavy with meaning. You will carry them both for the rest of your careers and the rest of your lives. The reprimand will ensure that no one forgets what you did wrong. The Navy Cross will ensure that no one forgets what you did right. That is our judgment. The ceremony that followed was brief. Both sisters stood at attention while the citation was read, a sanitized version of their 6-hour battle that somehow managed to convey the impossible odds without mentioning the impossible decision that had started it all. The medals were pinned to their chests by the same colonel who had just ended their career trajectories. When it was over, Sarah and Emma were escorted back to the transport that would return them to their unit. They sat side by side in the helicopter, watching the mountains pass beneath them. Neither spoke for a long time. "So," Emma said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "that happened." "It did. We just got court-martialed and decorated in the same day. I'm not sure there's a field manual for that." Sarah almost smiled. Probably the first time it's happened in Corps history. "Do you regret it?" Sarah considered the question. She thought about Corporal Martinez, about Hellman, about every order she had followed, when following meant watching good Marines die. She thought about the 300 men who were alive right now because she and Emma had refused to follow orders. "No," she said. "I don't." Emma nodded slowly. "Me neither." They flew on in silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western peaks. Somewhere ahead, there was a base waiting for them, a unit that would welcome them back, a war that continued regardless of what had happened on that frozen ridge. 6 months later, they were back on a different ridge, in a different sector of a war that seemed to have no end. The terrain was different, rocky instead of frozen, dusty instead of icy, but the job was the same. Watch, wait, protect. Sarah lay in her position, her rifle steady, her scope tracking movement in the valley below. 200 meters to her left, Emma occupied her own overwatch position, her presence a comfort that needed no words. Below them, a Marine patrol moved through hostile territory, their movements careful and professional. They didn't know 2 snipers were watching over them. They didn't know that 2 sisters had given up their futures to ensure that Marines like them would come home alive. They didn't need to know. That wasn't the point. Sarah watched the patrol reach the safety of their forward operating base, watched the last Marine disappear through the reinforced gate, and allowed herself to relax slightly. Another patrol protected. Another group of Marines who would never know how close danger had come. You ever think about what would have happened if we had followed orders? Emma's voice came to the radio, quiet and contemplative. Sometimes. And Sarah thought about it. 300 Marines dead in a frozen valley. An enemy emboldened by their victory. Families receiving folded flags and condolence letters. And 2 snipers who had followed orders and watched it all happen. "We made the right call," she said, "even if it was wrong." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, same ridge, different war, same mission, same sisters. The sun settled lower on the horizon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, an Afghan village was waking up to another day, its inhabitants unaware of the 2 Marines watching over them from the heights. Sarah adjusted her scope slightly, settling in for another long watch. Her rifle was steady, her focus absolute. The Navy cross beneath her uniform was a weight she had learned to carry. The reprimand in her service record was a mark she had learned to accept. Both facts existed together. Both always would. And somewhere below, Marines who would never know their names were still breathing, because 2 sisters had decided that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to do nothing. Sarah's story, their story, shows us that courage isn't always clean, and doing the right thing sometimes means breaking the rules. If this kept you engaged, hit that like button. Tell me in the comments, would you have followed orders or done what the Bennett sisters did? Subscribe if you haven't already. More stories like this are coming. See you in the next one.